Nobody at Westbrook High knew quiet freshman Luca Romano was hiding a deadly family secret. When two ruthless bullies cornered him after class, they ignited a fuse that would change their lives forever. Because Luca wasn't just another victim, he was the only son of New York's most feared Mafia boss. And tonight, they'd learn what happens when you mess with the wrong kid. Nico's heart thudded against his ribs as he stood by the locked gates of Pinewood High. At 15, he was already used to the hush that fell over a room when his last name was mentioned, but nobody here knew it yet. His family had relocated from the bustling city across the river just a week ago, and since day one, Nico understood his father wanted to keep things discreet. No bodyguards, no special accommodations, nothing to hint at the wealth and influence that clung to the Caprizi name like perfume on a silk scarf. For most people, the name Caprizi would be a whisper carried in back alleys and private clubs, conjuring images of powerful men in tailored suits, flanked by silent henchmen. Only a handful of families commanded that level of respect in certain parts of the city. But father had insisted Nico try to live like a regular teenager, at least for a while. "You deserve some normalcy," he'd said that morning, pulling Nico into a rare embrace. "And if you run into trouble," his voice had caught, rough with emotion, "don't hesitate to call." Trouble, Nico thought, scanning the throng of students milling around the campus. The word seemed too small for the life he'd known. Keeping secrets was second nature for him. Never mention what dad did. Never breathe a word about uncles who spoke in riddles. Never question why the hush of the mansion's halls was occasionally broken by coded phone calls. Taking a deep breath, Nico slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked through the crowd. He was leaner than some boys his age, but his dark eyes and quiet confidence gave him a certain edge, one that often made bullies pause for just a second before deciding whether or not to pounce. This time, though, a few local kids were far too eager to test him. They were waiting near the entrance to the main building, a pack of three. The leader, a tall brute with acne scarring his cheeks, watched Nico as if eyeing prey. "Nice bag," the boy jeered. "Looks brand new. Mommy and daddy spoil you, new kid." Nico simply offered a polite nod, trying to move past. He wasn't rattled by cheap taunts. Years of experience had taught him that reacting with anger drew more attention than it was worth. Besides, he had promised father he'd keep his head down. No one here needed to know who he was. But the boys didn't let him pass. One stepped into his path, face twisted in a sneer. "You ignoring us? That's real disrespectful." Nico took in the group with a single glance, recalling lessons from Uncle Rocco about reading threats quickly. The tall one was clearly in charge. The shortest one, with the buzz cut, reeked of insecurity. He'd be the one to launch an attack if he felt overshadowed. The third, quiet and broad-shouldered, probably followed orders without question. "I'm not ignoring you," Nico said, voice calm. "Just trying to get to homeroom. Could you let me through?" Instead of answering, the tall boy flicked Nico's cap, knocking it off. A hush fell over the immediate onlookers. No one knew the newcomer enough to step in on his behalf, but everyone sensed tension crackling in the air. Nico stooped to pick up his cap, heart pounding now, less from fear, more from the annoyance that flared whenever bullies tried to make an example out of him. Growing up in a Mafia family had certain drawbacks, but it had also taught Nico how to defend himself. His father always said, "There's a difference between seeking a fight and finishing it." Still, an image of father's stern face loomed in his mind, urging him to keep his cover. No headlines, no drama, no petty scuffles if it could be avoided. With as much composure as he could muster, Nico set his cap back on his head and sidestepped the group. "We can do this another time," he said quietly, "or not at all." For a moment, the tall bully simply stared, perhaps surprised that Nico wasn't quaking in his shoes. Then, as if deciding it was too early in the day for a big scene, he shrugged. "Walk away, loser." Nico slipped inside the building, ignoring the jeers that echoed behind him. He exhaled, grateful that the confrontation had only been verbal. In his old life, disrespect like that might have ended very differently. Instead of morning geometry, there might have been a trip to a quiet dock or a ride in a tinted SUV. Unpleasant scenarios that hovered at the corners of Nico's memories. He shook off the thought and resolved that no matter what, he would keep a low profile. Throughout that first week, Nico tried to blend in. He sat at the back of classrooms, completed assignments diligently, and avoided drawing attention. He discovered a small reading nook near the library, far from the school's busy cafeteria, where he could spend lunchtime without disturbance. But bullies had a way of sniffing out vulnerabilities, and it wasn't long before they decided to make him their target again. It started with them flicking paper wads at his head during biology. The teacher never noticed, buried in a lengthy explanation of cell division. Next came a prank in the boys' locker room, where Nico found his gym clothes splashed with ketchup from a stolen lunch tray. He kept quiet, choosing to rinse them in the sink rather than complain. Complaining would mean attention, and attention meant trouble he'd promised to avoid. Then, on Friday afternoon, just as Nico was starting to think maybe he'd managed to slip under their radar, he found himself cornered in the deserted hallway that led to the music room. The tall bully, Troy, he'd finally learned his name, blocked Nico's path with a sneer. The short, buzz-cut kid, Kevin, hovered on Troy's left, an unpleasant grin stretching his lips. The quiet, broad-shouldered one, Jonas, stood to the right, cracking his knuckles. Nico's pulse pounded. He scanned for an escape route, but realized the hallway was narrow, the doors locked at this hour, and the only way out was behind the three bullies. "Hey, new kid," Troy said, leveling a cold stare at Nico. "You've been real quiet lately. Think you're too good for us." Nico fixed his gaze on Troy's chest, bracing himself. A pang of regret twisted his insides. If he were any other kid, perhaps he'd beg for mercy or try to bargain. But Nico knew exactly who he was and what he could do if he unleashed even half of what he'd learned from his uncles. Yet he also knew if he made a scene, if he left these three battered and bruised, word would travel. Father's promise of a clean start would shatter. He had to handle this carefully. Before Nico could respond, Kevin jabbed a finger into his shoulder. "We asked you a question." Nico took a small step back, swallowing the anger that surged in his throat. "I'm not trying to act better than anyone. I just mind my business." Troy smirked, rolling his shoulders. "Your business is about to get you in trouble, new kid. You see, Kevin and Jonas and I, we run these halls. We decide who's cool and who's not." Nico held his breath. He didn't want to fight, but something told him there'd be no easy exit this time. "Let me guess," he said softly. "I'm not cool." Troy let out a harsh laugh, and Kevin snickered. "You catch on fast." A voice in Nico's mind, one that sounded uncannily like Uncle Rocco's, spoke up. "Never throw the first punch. But if you must defend yourself, do it decisively." The corridor was cramped, with nowhere to run. If things escalated, Nico would have to defend himself. But just then, a teacher's voice boomed from around the corner. "Hey, you boys have practice to get to, or do I need to write you up for loitering?" Troy immediately stepped back, shooting a hateful glare at Nico. "This isn't over," he muttered before the trio slunk away, leaving Nico breathing hard, adrenaline crashing through his veins. When he got home, the house was quiet. Mother was off at a charity event. Father was still out handling business. Nico went to his room, threw down his backpack, and sank onto his bed. The tension from the day thrummed in his body. He remembered Father's words. If you run into trouble, don't hesitate to call. But how could he make that call? He'd promised he'd keep a low profile. He didn't want to admit, only a week in, that he was already in the crosshairs of bullies. He stared at the phone for a long time, images of Troy's sneering face flickering in his mind. Then he dropped it onto the mattress and stood up. He'd handle this. Alone. He wasn't some helpless kid. He was Nico Caprizi, after all. He didn't need to rely on Father's shadow. Monday came around sooner than he liked. Nico walked into Pinewood High with a knot in his stomach, but tried to maintain an air of calm. For a while, it seemed he'd been granted a temporary reprieve. There were no confrontations in morning classes, no paper wads lobbed his way. Even during lunch, the bullies were nowhere to be found. He ventured into the cafeteria for the first time, grabbing a tray of soggy pizza and limp salad. Students chatted in clusters, ignoring him. Nico almost felt relief. Then, as he headed to the trash can to dump the remains of his meal, an arm snaked around his neck from behind. He felt a strong yank backward, the cafeteria walls spinning. Instinctively, Nico flailed, trying to regain his balance, but the arm tightened, forcing him to drop his tray with a clatter. The world erupted in gasps and shouts as Troy's face appeared next to his ear, twisted with glee. Kevin and Jonas stood guard, snickering at the sight of Nico pinned in a chokehold. "Not so tough now, huh?" Troy hissed. Nico's mind raced. He felt the press of the boy's forearm against his windpipe. He couldn't breathe. Panic welled up, but so did that old training. He ground his heel into Troy's foot, twisting just enough to slip out of the choke, elbow cocked. But he paused an inch before driving that elbow into Troy's jaw with a practice strike that would have sent the bully reeling. He paused because he noticed a phone camera pointed at them. If he demonstrated that kind of skill, it wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Troy recoiled anyway, more out of surprise than actual pain, but it was enough for Nico to pull free. Coughing, he massaged his neck, ignoring the startled faces of the surrounding students. "Fight! Fight!" someone chanted, and a ring of onlookers began to form, anticipating a brawl. Nico's pulse hammered, but he forced himself to step back. "I'm not fighting you," he said, voice shaking. He'd seen real violence, and he knew how quickly it spiraled. He refused to trigger something that might bring more of his family's secrets to light. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Troy, furious at being shown up, lunged forward, fists swinging. Nico dodged with minimal movement, sending the bigger boy stumbling past him. Students laughed. Kevin and Jonas tried to wedge themselves between Troy and Nico, hoping to help their leader save face, but the cafeteria monitor finally stormed over, face red and whistle shrieking. "Enough! Everyone disperse." The grown man's voice cracked like a whip, and the crowd melted away in seconds. Troy glared at Nico with a promise of future revenge in his eyes. Kevin and Jonas trailed behind him, scowling. Nico exhaled heavily, grateful the chaos had ended before it turned truly violent. But he knew, deep down, that Troy and his gang would be back. They wouldn't let a perceived humiliation slide, not when half the lunchroom had witnessed it. Sliding his phone from his pocket, Nico stared at the blank screen. Every instinct told him to dial father. One phone call, and a quiet word with a few well-dressed men in suits, and the bullying would vanish overnight. But that would also draw the kind of attention they'd come here to avoid. He'd promised he wouldn't let that happen. So he slipped the phone away and resolved, "I'll handle it on my own terms." But a part of him understood this was only the beginning. Sooner or later, the Caprizi name would surface, and when it did, Troy and his gang would realize they'd picked on the wrong kid. Because sometimes, the smallest spark can set off the biggest inferno. And, with a father like Don Caprizi, any threat to his son was an invitation to war. Nico stood at his locker the next day, hands trembling despite his attempt to stay composed. The cafeteria altercation loomed in his memory like a storm cloud, and he braced himself for Troy's next move. He sensed eyes on him, though whether from curious classmates or potential bullies, he wasn't sure. Paranoia took root. What if they came at him in a more secluded spot? What if they discovered who his father was? The questions rattled in his mind, building a panic he struggled to contain. He headed to math class, hoping to slip into the back row unnoticed. But the moment he entered the room, the air changed. Troy and Kevin were seated in the middle row, their heads turning in unison to track Nico's every move. Jonas wasn't there, probably off pulling some new trick. Nico forced his gaze forward, ignoring the stifled snickers behind him as he chose a seat as far away as possible. The class began, with the teacher droning on about quadratic equations. Despite trying to focus, Nico felt the weight of tension pressing down on his shoulders. Every so often, Troy would flick a tiny scrap of paper at him. Nothing big, just enough to remind Nico that the conflict was far from over. When the bell finally rang, Nico rushed out, only to be cornered again. Troy sidled up next to him in the hallway, Kevin close behind, their eyes filled with malicious glee. "You got lucky yesterday," Troy said under his breath, careful not to draw a teacher's attention. "But your luck's run out. Meet us behind the gym after school." Nico set his jaw, trying not to reveal the swirl of anxiety in his gut. "I have things to do after school," he lied. Troy snorted. "Yeah, you've got a date with me, new kid. Unless you want us to track you down in front of everyone. Think about how embarrassing that'll be for you." An ugly laugh escaped Kevin's mouth. They backed off, merging into the stream of students. Nico stood there, breathing fast. He had to make a decision. Face them now in a controlled setting or keep running until they inevitably cornered him again. The calmer part of his mind told him to find a teacher or a counselor to handle this the normal way. But something about that felt wrong, like it'd be betraying everything he'd learned growing up. He didn't want to cower. Behind the gym, Nico mused grimly. That spot was notoriously secluded, out of sight from security cameras. A perfect place for bullies to do their worst. He tucked his hands into his pockets and continued down the hall, mind churning. I can handle them. I just need to make sure no one captures it on video or links it back to father. All afternoon, nervous energy coiled in his stomach. He imagined 1,000 outcomes for the confrontation. Each one ended with him fighting, and the thought made his heart pound in a conflicting mix of anticipation and dread. Father had always taught him self-defense, but he was to use it only as a last resort. "You're my son," Father had said once, "and we capricious don't start unnecessary battles. But we don't run from them, either." That day's final bell rang in what felt like a funeral dirge. Students poured out of the classrooms, free at last for the weekend. Nico walked against the wave of bodies surging toward the exits, heading toward the back of the gym, where the loading dock sat empty after hours. Sure enough, Troy, Kevin, and Jonas waited. Troy's posture radiated confidence, like a predator sure of his kill. Kevin was cracking his knuckles, while Jonas looked vaguely bored, as if he were just there for the show. Nico approached with measured steps, dropping his backpack near a concrete wall. The sun dipped lower in the sky, elongating the bully's shadows. "I'm here," Nico said, voice steady. "What do you want?" Troy smirked. "I want you to learn your place." A flicker of anger bubbled in Nico. "My place?" He recalled the hush that fell on entire neighborhoods when Don Caprizi's name was mentioned. He remembered men bowing their heads in respect or fear. He remembered a city block that changed hands overnight when Father snapped his fingers. "I know my place," Nico murmured. "It's you who doesn't have a clue." With a guttural snarl, Troy launched himself at Nico, aiming a wild punch at his face. Nico had spent years training in a private gym back home, so he recognized the telegraphed movement instantly. He sidestepped, letting Troy stumble past. Kevin rushed in next, surprisingly quick for his small frame. He threw a jab. Nico blocked, feeling the impact rattle his forearm. Then Jonas lunged from behind, and Nico's instincts roared to life. He dropped low, rolling aside to avoid being tackled. The bullies regrouped, circling him like wolves around a lone deer, but Nico was far from defenseless. He breathed evenly, arms raised, scanning for the next attack. He had to end this quickly, or risk being outnumbered. Jonas charged, arms outstretched. Nico snapped a front kick into Jonas's thigh, causing the bigger boy to stagger. Kevin tried to capitalize on an opening, darting in to land a punch. Nico twisted, hooking a quick shot into Kevin's ribs, not enough to break anything, but enough to knock the wind out of him. Kevin doubled over, wheezing. Troy's eyes blazed with fury. He swung again, and this time, Nico blocked with his forearm, braced by years of practice. He wanted to avoid doing serious harm, but Troy's aggression left little choice. Nico parried the next punch and, with a precise motion, drove his fist into Troy's gut. Troy gasped, stumbling backward. A momentary hush fell on the four of them. Kevin coughed, Jonas winced, and Troy clutched his stomach, trying to hide how badly he was hurt. Nico could almost taste the confusion in the air as the bullies realized the new kid was not some easy victim. "Why you fight like you've done this before," Troy snarled, breathing heavily. "What are you, some kind of martial arts freak?" Nico shook his head, adrenaline still pumping. "Let's just say I've had practice. Are we done here?" At that, Troy's face twisted with a wild mix of humiliation and rage. "This isn't over," he spat, voice trembling with anger. "Nobody humiliates me in front of my crew." He lunged again, swinging a looping punch aimed at Nico's temple. Nico raised his guard, bracing for impact, when a sudden sound froze them all in place. The crunch of gravel under car tires. A sleek black sedan turned the corner of the building, its tinted windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Nico's blood ran cold. That was not any ordinary vehicle. It was a model he recognized intimately, part of Father's private fleet. The car rolled to a stop, and the rear door opened. Out stepped a tall man in a charcoal suit, his expression carved from stone. It was Marco, one of Father's closest aides. The bullies gaped, confusion etched on their faces. To them, this was just some stranger in a fancy suit. But to Nico, it was the embodiment of his father's far-reaching power. "Nicholas," Marco said, voice low and respectful as he approached. "Your father sent me to pick you up. Is there a problem here?" Nico's heart pounded. This was exactly the scenario he'd hoped to avoid, public exposure of who he was. But it seemed Father had discovered what was going on after all, or at least suspected trouble was brewing. He always has ears everywhere, Nico thought, a mix of relief and dread washing over him. Troy, Kevin, and Jonas stood there, dumbfounded. Troy's mouth opened and closed, as if trying to form a snide remark, but failing to muster the courage. Kevin looked like he wanted to bolt, but fear had pinned his feet. Jonas's gaze darted between the imposing figure of Marco and Nico's calm, determined stance, as though a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Nico took a steadying breath. Part of him wanted to keep up the charade, but he also knew this was the moment the bullies would realize they'd messed with the wrong kid. "No problem," he said, voice firm. "We were just working out a disagreement." Marco nodded, glancing at the three bruised bullies. "Understood. Shall I inform your father that everything's under control, or does he need to speak to someone in the school administration?" At the mention of father, Nico saw Troy blanch. Kevin took a small step back, and Jonas's eyes widened. The gravity in Marco's tone hinted at ramifications that extended far beyond a principal's office. Slowly, Nico shook his head. "No need for that," he said, meeting Troy's eyes. He saw the fear flickering there, fear of a power they couldn't comprehend. This was not mere playground intimidation. They now sensed it in the stoic presence of Marco, in the glint of the sedan's tinted windows, and perhaps in the subtle steel of Nico's own demeanor. Troy swallowed hard. He looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Finally, he mustered a shaky breath. I'm sorry," he stammered, pointing to his two friends. "We were just messing around." Kevin and Jonas nodded hastily, echoing, "Yeah, sorry." Nico studied them. It was surprising. Just moments before, they were ready to pummel him. Now, they stood trembling. A pang of pity flickered in Nico's chest. "If only they knew who my father is," he thought. "They might really be shaking in their boots." But out loud, he simply said, "Apology accepted. Let's just leave each other alone." Troy nodded so vigorously his hair flopped over his forehead. "Sure, yeah, absolutely." He signaled to the others, and they shuffled away, throwing wary glances over their shoulders at Marco and the black sedan. Nico's shoulders sagged in relief. The adrenaline seeped out of him, replaced by a tremor of anxiety over what came next. Was Father furious with him? Had he ordered Marco to drag him home to face punishment for nearly blowing their cover? Marco placed a hand on Nico's shoulder. "I didn't mean to scare you or your friends," he said quietly, a slight smile curving his lips. "But your father wanted to ensure your safety. He suspected you might run into problems adapting to a new school." Nico blinked back a sting of tears he hadn't expected. I'm fine," he managed. "Just a little drama." "Understood," Marco replied, voice neutral. "Let's get you home." Nico nodded, retrieving his backpack and sliding into the sedan's back seat. The plush interior smelled of leather and faint cigar smoke. As Marco started the engine, Nico peered out the tinted window, mind racing. A wave of complicated relief washed over him. He'd handled the bullies, at least for now. But the cat was half out of the bag. Whether or not Troy and his friends truly grasped the depth of the Caprese influence remained to be seen. During the ride, Nico mulled over everything that had happened. He had successfully defended himself without exposing his father's full identity, though glimpses of it had certainly bled through. Part of him felt triumphant that he hadn't cowered. Another part felt uneasy, realizing just how precarious his situation was. When they arrived at the family's new estate, a lavish home with tall gates and discreet security cameras, Nico found Father waiting in the foyer. Don Caprese was a commanding presence in a tailored suit, dark eyes unreadable beneath heavy brows. "Nicholas," he said, and in that single word, Nico heard warmth and concern that few outsiders ever did. "I trust Marco arrived in time." Nico nodded slowly. "Yes, Father, but next time, I can handle it on my own." A faint smile touched the corners of Father's mouth. He placed a hand on Nico's shoulder. "I know you can. You've shown restraint, a quality too many in our line of work lack. I'm proud of you." That simple statement touched Nico more than he'd let on. Father's approval was a rare prize, something that dwarfed any petty victory over high school bullies. "And the bullies?" Father asked. "They won't trouble you anymore?" Nico glanced away, recalling Troy's fearful expression. "I don't think so. They got the message." Father nodded, his eyes distant, as if weighing possibilities. Should they persist, I'll ensure they understand what happens when they cross a caprizi. A shiver ran down Nico's spine. He remembered the old stories. People who crossed his father rarely made the same mistake twice. But he also knew father had promised him a measure of normalcy. Maybe he'd keep his distance, letting Nico navigate teen life on his own. Maybe. For now, Nico simply exhaled, relief and lingering tension mixing in his chest. School bullies were nothing compared to what the Caprizi family could unleash if truly provoked. They have no idea, Nico thought, a tiny ember of satisfaction lighting in his heart. No idea at all. And with that, the Mafia boss's son took the first real step toward carving his own path. One where he balanced a secret legacy of power with the everyday trials of being an ordinary teenager. In the aftermath of the confrontation, he knew that Troy, Kevin, and Jonas would think twice before messing with him again, if they valued their peace, and maybe even their lives. For in the quiet corners of Pinewood High, everyone would soon whisper that the new kid, Nico, was far from ordinary, and that messing with him might just be the biggest mistake a bully could ever make. 2 of 2.